across the Mediterranean around 1200 BC have been blamed for one of history's most catastrophic collapses. The Hittite Empire, which had dominated Anatolia for centuries, vanished almost overnight. The Mycenaean civilization of Greece, home to the legendary heroes of the Trojan War, crumbled into ruins. Cities across the Levant burned, trade networks disintegrated, and literacy itself disappeared in some regions as the Bronze Age gave way to a darker, more fragmented Iron Age. For generations, scholars have treated the Sea Peoples as history's great villains, a horde of barbarian destroyers who brought down an entire world. But recent discoveries, drawing on ancient DNA, climate science, and new archaeological evidence, are forcing us to completely rethink this narrative. The Sea Peoples, it turns out, were not the cause of the Bronze Age collapse, but rather its most visible symptom: refugees and migrants caught up in a perfect storm of environmental catastrophe, economic breakdown, and social upheaval. And the story that is emerging from the latest research is far more complex, far more human, and far more relevant to our own time than anyone could have imagined. What we thought we knew about the Sea Peoples was wrong, and the truth is only now beginning to come into focus. The traditional story of the Sea Peoples has always been straightforward, almost cinematic in its simplicity. Around 1200 BC, according to Egyptian records carved into the temple walls at Medinet Habu, a coalition of foreign invaders attacked the eastern Mediterranean. Pharaoh Ramesses III described them in dramatic terms, claiming that no land could stand before their arms, and that they came by sea and by land, destroying everything in their path. The Egyptians managed to repel these attackers in a series of battles, both on land and in a dramatic naval engagement depicted in vivid relief carvings. But while Egypt survived, much of the rest of the Bronze Age world did not.
The term Sea Peoples includes a myriad of groups like the Shurdan, Shekelesh, Peliset, and Denyen. The Peliset, often associated with the Philistines, were notable for their interactions with the ancient Israelites.
The Hittites, the Mycenaeans, the city-states of Cyprus and the Levant all fell within a span of decades, and the Sea Peoples were implicated in nearly every destruction. For over a century, this narrative held firm. The Sea Peoples were invaders, probably from the Aegean or beyond, who launched a coordinated assault on the civilized world and brought it to its knees. They were history's great destroyers, a force of chaos that ended an age. But this story, compelling as it is, has always had problems. Who exactly were these Sea Peoples? Why did they attack? Where did they come from? And where did they go? The Egyptian texts give us names for various groups within the Confederation, names like the Peliset, the Tejeker, the Shekelesh, and the Denyen, but these names are maddeningly vague, and attempts to connect them to known peoples and places have been speculative at best, and perhaps most troubling of all, the timeline does not quite work. Archaeological evidence shows that many of the great Bronze Age centers were already in decline before the Sea Peoples appeared, suggesting that something else was already going wrong. The Sea Peoples, it seemed, arrived at a world that was already collapsing, which raises a crucial question: were they the cause, or were they just another consequence? This is where the new discoveries come in, and they are changing everything. In recent years, scientists have begun to apply the tools of ancient DNA analysis to the question of the Sea Peoples, extracting genetic material from human remains found at sites associated with their arrival. The most significant of these studies focused on the ancient city of Ashkelon on the coast of what is now Israel, which became a Philistine stronghold in the early Iron Age. The Philistines, one of the groups most closely associated with the Sea Peoples, have long been a subject of fascination, appearing in the Bible as the enemies of the Israelites and in Egyptian records as part of the invading coalition. By analyzing DNA from individuals buried at Ashkelon during the transition from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age, researchers were able to trace the genetic origins of the Philistines with unprecedented precision. What they found was remarkable. The early Iron Age population of Ashkelon showed a clear genetic signature from southern Europe, particularly from the Aegean region, including Crete, Sardinia, and the broader Mediterranean world. This was new ancestry, not present in the Bronze Age population, confirming that a migration event had indeed occurred. The Sea Peoples, or at least the Philistines among them, had come from Europe, just as the ancient texts suggested. But here is where the story gets more interesting and more complicated. The European genetic signature was strong in the early Iron Age, but by the later Iron Age, just a few generations later, it had almost completely disappeared. The Philistines had intermarried with the local Canaanite population so extensively that their genetic distinctiveness vanished, even as their cultural identity persisted for centuries. This tells us something crucial. The Sea Peoples were not a conquering army that displaced existing populations, but migrants who integrated, adapted, and became part of the existing social fabric. They were not destroyers in the way we have imagined, but people looking for new homes in a world that was falling apart around them. And that world was indeed falling apart, for reasons that had little to do with invading armies. Parallel research into ancient climate records has revealed that the eastern Mediterranean was experiencing a prolonged and severe drought during the Late Bronze Age, a megadrought that lasted for decades and would have had catastrophic effects on agricultural societies. Tree ring data, pollen records, and sediment cores from lakes and seas all point to the same conclusion. The climate was changing, and it was changing in ways that made life increasingly difficult for the Great Bronze Age civilizations. The Hittite archives, deciphered from clay tablets found in the ruins of their capital, contain desperate letters from the final years of the empire, pleading for grain shipments to stave off famine. One letter from the Hittite king to the king of Ugarit, a coastal city in what is now Syria, is particularly telling. "It is a matter of life and death," the Hittite ruler writes, begging for food. Ugarit itself would soon be destroyed, its final layer of occupation showing signs of violent destruction and hasty abandonment. But the destruction was not the beginning of the crisis. It was the end result of a long process of environmental stress, economic strain, and social breakdown. The drought would have caused crop failures, which would have led to food shortages, which would have triggered famines, migrations, and conflicts over dwindling resources. The great palace economies of the Bronze Age, which depended on centralized control of agricultural surpluses and long-distance trade, were particularly vulnerable to this kind of systemic shock. When the rains failed and the harvests withered, the entire system began to unravel. And in that context, the Sea Peoples begin to look less like invaders and more like refugees, populations displaced by the same environmental catastrophe that was destabilizing the entire region. This new understanding is supported by another crucial piece of evidence. The Sea Peoples were not a unified force with a single origin. The Egyptian texts describe them as a coalition of different groups, each with their own name and presumably their own homeland, and the archaeological and genetic evidence confirms this. The Philistines, as we have seen, came from the Aegean, but other groups within the Sea Peoples Confederation may have had different origins. Some may have come from Anatolia, displaced by the collapse of the Hittite Empire. Others may have come from the Balkans or even from within the eastern Mediterranean itself, coastal populations forced to take to the sea when their own cities and farmlands became uninhabitable. What united them was not a shared ethnicity or a coordinated plan of conquest, but a shared desperation, a need to find new places to live in a world where the old certainties were crumbling. The attacks on Egypt and other surviving states were not part of a grand strategy, but the actions of people who had nowhere else to go, trying to force their way into regions that still had food and resources. The Egyptians, with their centralized state and the natural defenses provided by the Nile Delta, were able to repel these incursions, but many other regions were not so fortunate. And in places like Ashkelon, the newcomers did not destroy the existing population but settled alongside them, creating new hybrid cultures that blended elements from both the migrants and the locals. The Philistine culture that emerged in the early Iron Age, with its distinctive pottery styles and architectural forms, was not purely European but a fusion, a new identity forged in the crucible of crisis. The implications of these discoveries extend far beyond the specific question of who the Sea Peoples were. They force us to reconsider the entire narrative of the Bronze Age collapse, shifting the focus from human agency to environmental and systemic factors. The collapse was not caused by a single event or a single group of people, but by a cascade of interconnected failures. Climate change triggered agricultural crises, which undermined the economic foundations of the palace states, which led to political instability and the breakdown of trade networks, which in turn created conditions for mass migrations and conflicts. The Sea Peoples were part of this cascade, both victims and participants, people trying to survive in a world that was no longer able to support the complex, interconnected civilizations of the Bronze Age. This perspective has profound implications for how we understand historical change. It suggests that even the most powerful and sophisticated societies are vulnerable to environmental shocks, and that when systems fail, the results can be catastrophic and far-reaching. The Bronze Age collapse was not an isolated event, but part of a pattern that has repeated throughout history, from the fall of the Roman Empire to the crises of our own time. And the lesson is clear. Resilience in the face of environmental and systemic challenges is not guaranteed, and the line between stability and collapse can be frighteningly thin. But the new research also offers a more hopeful message, one that emerges from the genetic evidence of integration and adaptation. The Philistines, despite arriving as outsiders in a time of crisis, did not remain isolated. They married into local families, adopted local customs, even as they maintained their own cultural practices, and became part of the region's complex social mosaic. Within a few generations, the genetic markers that identified them as migrants had been diluted and absorbed, but their cultural legacy persisted. This tells us that even in the darkest times, human societies have a remarkable capacity for adaptation and integration. The end of the Bronze Age was not the end of civilization in the Eastern Mediterranean, but a transformation, a painful and chaotic transition from one way of life to another. The Iron Age that followed was different, smaller in scale and less centralized, but it was also the age that gave birth to the alphabet, to new forms of political organization, and eventually to the classical civilizations of Greece and Rome. The Sea Peoples, far from being simple destroyers, were part of this transformation, agents of change in a world that was being remade by forces beyond anyone's control. Their story, as revealed by the latest discoveries, is not a story of villainy, but of survival, adaptation, and the complex ways in which human societies respond to crisis. Understanding the Sea Peoples in this new light fundamentally changes how we think about migration and identity in the ancient world and beyond. The genetic evidence from Ashkelon shows that migration was not simple replacement but a dynamic interaction where newcomers and locals negotiated new forms of coexistence. The rapid disappearance of the European genetic signature demonstrates that genetic ancestry and cultural identity are not the same thing, and that cultures can persist even as populations change. The Sea Peoples were not a foreign invasion that destroyed a pure Bronze Age world. They were migrants who became part of a diverse and constantly evolving Mediterranean landscape, contributing to new cultures and identities that would shape the region for centuries. The story of the Sea Peoples is ultimately about how civilizations, as they came to be known, swept across the eastern Mediterranean around 1200 BC, leaving behind a trail of destruction so complete that entire civilizations vanished from the map. The Hittite Empire, which had ruled Anatolia for centuries, collapsed. The great Mcinian palaces of Greece, immortalized in Homer's epics, burned to the ground. Coastal cities from Cyprus to the Levant were reduced to rubble, and trade networks that had connected the ancient world for generations simply ceased to exist. It was one of the most catastrophic periods in human history, a moment when the Bronze Age world, with all its complexity and sophistication, came crashing down in what scholars now call the Late Bronze Age collapse. And at the center of this chaos stood the Sea Peoples, a confederation of attackers whose origins were as mysterious as their motives. Egyptian pharaoh Ramesses III, one of the few rulers to successfully repel their invasion, immortalized them on the walls of his temple at Medinet Habu, describing how no land could stand before their arms. But who were they? Where did they come from? For 200 years, since the decipherment of hieroglyphics allowed us to read Ramesses' account, these questions have remained unanswered. The Sea Peoples left no written records of their own, no cities bearing their name, no clear archaeological signature that could pin them to a specific homeland. They appeared, they destroyed, and then they seemed to vanish into the mists of history, leaving behind only ruins and questions. Until now, the mystery of the Sea Peoples has been one of archaeology's most enduring puzzles, a historical whodunit with no shortage of theories, but precious little hard evidence. That is, until scientists learn to read a different kind of record, one written not in stone or clay, but in the very bones of the people who lived through that tumultuous time. The ancient port city of Ashkelon, perched on the Mediterranean coast of what is now Israel, has long been a focal point for scholars trying to understand the Sea Peoples.
Through DNA analysis and archaeological finds, scientists have concluded that the Philistines did immigrate from the Aegean Islands, Crete, and the Greek mainland, as they have a lot of similarity with Mycenaean culture. This is why most scholars theorize that the Philistines may have been part of the mysterious Sea Peoples.
During the Iron Age, Ashkelon was identified as a Philistine city, and the Philistines themselves have been linked to the Sea Peoples Confederation, appearing in Egyptian records as one of the groups that attacked the Nile Delta. The city's location made it a natural landing point for anyone arriving by sea, and its archaeological layers tell a story of dramatic change. Between the late Bronze Age and the early Iron Age, something fundamental shifted in Ashkelon. The pottery styles changed, new architectural techniques appeared, and burial practices took on forms that were distinctly different from what had come before. For decades, archaeologists debated what this meant. Was it evidence of a mass migration, a violent conquest, or simply the gradual adoption of new cultural practices by the local population? The material culture suggested newcomers, but material culture can be adopted without people moving. Trade and cultural exchange can explain many things, and without more definitive proof, the question remained open. Some scholars argued that the Sea Peoples were local populations displaced by drought or famine, while others insisted they must have come from across the sea, perhaps from the Aegean world or even further afield. The debate seemed destined to continue indefinitely, with each side marshalling archaeological evidence that could be interpreted in multiple ways. But in recent years, a new tool has emerged that can cut through this ambiguity with remarkable precision: ancient DNA. A team of researchers, led by geneticist Michael Feldman and archaeologist Daniel Master, working with the Max Planck Institute and other institutions, decided to apply the latest techniques in ancient genomics to the question of the Sea Peoples.
The term Sea Peoples includes a myriad of groups like the Shurden, Shekelesh, Peliset, and Denyen. The Peliset, often associated with the Philistines, were notable for their interactions with the ancient Israelites. Their raids, alongside economic decline and internal strife, contributed to the downfall of several Bronze Age kingdoms. Beyond their martial endeavors, they were settlers, forming city-states like Ashkelon, Ashdod, and Gaza. Despite their significant historical impact,
they focused on human remains excavated from Ashkelon, carefully selecting individuals from 3 distinct time periods to create a genetic time series that would span the Bronze to Iron Age transition. The first group came from the late Bronze Age, before the Sea Peoples' arrival. The second group, the most crucial, came from the early Iron Age, the period immediately following the collapse when the Philistines first appeared in the historical record. The third group came from the later Iron Age, several centuries after the initial upheaval. By comparing the DNA of these 3 populations, the researchers hoped to see if there was any genetic evidence for a migration event, and if so, where the migrants might have come from. The process was technically challenging, as DNA degrades over time and the hot, dry climate of the Levant is not ideal for preservation. But advances in DNA extraction and sequencing technologies have made it possible to recover genetic information from even poorly preserved samples. The team extracted DNA from the bones of 10 individuals, focusing on infants and children whose remains were found in burial contexts clearly associated with the early Iron Age Philistine culture. And when they sequenced those genomes and compared them to a database of ancient and modern populations from across Europe, the Near East, and beyond, a clear pattern emerged that would finally answer the question that had vexed scholars for 2 centuries. The DNA revealed something that the pottery and architecture had only hinted at. The early Iron Age population of Ashkelon was genetically distinct from the Bronze Age population that had lived there before. The difference was not subtle. The early Iron Age individuals carried a significant component of European-related ancestry, a genetic signature that was completely absent in the earlier Bronze Age residents. When the researchers ran statistical models to determine where this European ancestry might have come from, the best match was with populations from southern Europe, particularly from Bronze Age Crete, Sardinia, and the Iberian Peninsula. The early Iron Age Philistines of Ashkelon derived roughly 40% of their ancestry from a European source, with the rest coming from the local Levantine gene pool. This was not the result of ancient gene flow that had been present in the region for millennia. This was new, a recent admixture event that coincided precisely with the arrival of the Sea Peoples, as described in the Egyptian texts. The genetic data provided the smoking gun that archaeology alone could not. The Sea Peoples, or at least the group that became the Philistines, had indeed migrated from Europe, most likely from the Aegean region or the broader Mediterranean world, and they had arrived in Canaan at the end of the Bronze Age, just as the ancient texts suggested. The mystery of their origins, debated since the 19th century, had been solved by reading the genetic code preserved in the bones of children who died over 3,000 years ago. The Sea Peoples were not a local uprising, not a displaced Near Eastern population, but genuine migrants from across the sea, and the sea they crossed was the Mediterranean, bringing them from the world of the Aegean to the shores of the Levant. But the story that the DNA told was more nuanced and more fascinating than a simple tale of invasion and conquest. When the researchers examined the genomes of individuals from the later Iron Age, several centuries after the initial arrival of the Sea Peoples, they found something unexpected. The European genetic signature had vanished. By the later Iron Age, the Philistines of Ashkelon were genetically indistinguishable from their Canaanite neighbors. The European ancestry that had been so prominent in the early Iron Age had been diluted and absorbed into the local gene pool, disappearing within just a few generations. This rapid genetic assimilation tells us something profound about how the Philistines integrated into the region. They did not remain a separate, isolated population. Instead, they intermarried extensively with the local inhabitants, and within 2 or 3 generations, the genetic distinctiveness that marked their arrival had been erased. Finding challenges simplistic narratives of ancient migration and conquest, the Philistines did not arrive, displace the local population, and establish a genetically isolated enclave. They arrived, settled, and became part of the existing social fabric, even as they maintained their distinct cultural identity. The fact that the European genetic signature disappeared so quickly suggests that there were no strong social taboos against intermarriage, no rigid boundaries separating the newcomers from the established residents. The world of the ancient Mediterranean, it seems, was far more fluid and interconnected than we often imagine, with people of different origins living side by side and forming families together. This genetic fluidity stands in stark contrast to the cultural persistence of the Philistine identity, which lasted for centuries and left a lasting mark on the region, even giving its name to the land, Palestine, derived from Philistia. The implications of this discovery extend far beyond the specific question of who the Sea Peoples were. It provides a powerful case study in the relationship between genetics, culture, and identity, showing how these 3 elements can diverge in unexpected ways. The Philistines arrived with a distinct genetic signature that marked them as outsiders, migrants from a distant land, but within a few generations, that genetic distinctiveness had faded, even as their cultural identity remained strong. They continued to make their distinctive pottery, to build their temples in their own architectural style, to worship their own gods, and to maintain their political independence as a confederation of city-states. Genetically, they became Canaanites, but culturally, they remained Philistines. This disconnect between genetic ancestry and cultural identity is a reminder that human societies are not defined by biology alone. Culture, language, religion, and political allegiance can persist long after the genetic signatures of migration have been diluted and absorbed. The Philistines are a perfect example of this principle, and their story, revealed through ancient DNA, challenges us to think more carefully about what we mean when we talk about the origins and identity of ancient peoples. It also highlights the importance of what geneticists call temporally dense sampling, the practice of analyzing DNA from multiple time periods at the same site. If the researchers had only sampled the later Iron Age population, they would have missed the European genetic signature entirely and might have concluded that the Philistines were simply a local Canaanite population with a distinctive culture. It was only by sampling the early Iron Age, the moment of initial contact and migration, that they were able to detect the transient genetic signal that proved the Sea Peoples had come from Europe. The discovery also sheds new light on the broader phenomenon of the Late Bronze Age collapse, one of the most dramatic and mysterious events in ancient history. For decades, scholars have debated what caused this collapse, with theories ranging from climate change and drought to internal social upheaval and systems failure. The Sea Peoples have often been cast as the villains of this story, the barbarian hordes who swept in and destroyed the civilized world, but the genetic evidence from Ashkelon suggests a more complex picture. The Sea Peoples were not just raiders or invaders, they were migrants, people on the move with their families, looking for new places to settle in a world that was already in crisis. The Egyptian reliefs at Medinet Habu, which depict the Sea Peoples' attacks, show not just warriors but also women and children traveling in ox carts, suggesting that entire communities were on the move. This was not a simple military campaign but a mass migration driven by forces we can only guess at. Perhaps their homelands in the Aegean had become uninhabitable due to drought or conflict. Perhaps they were fleeing the same systemic collapse that was affecting the entire eastern Mediterranean. Whatever the cause, they arrived in the Levant at a moment of profound instability, and their arrival both contributed to and was shaped by the chaos of the age, not caused by a single factor, and the Sea Peoples were not simply destroyers but also survivors, people trying to find a place in a world that was falling apart. Their story, revealed through the DNA of the Philistines, is a story of migration, adaptation, and survival in one of history's darkest hours. Understanding the Sea Peoples through ancient DNA offers lessons that resonate in our own time. The story of the Philistines shows us that migration is not simple replacement but a dynamic interaction where newcomers and established residents negotiate new forms of coexistence. Genetic ancestry and cultural identity can follow different trajectories, with genetic signatures fading even as cultural practices persist. The Sea Peoples, once the most mysterious figures in ancient history, are mysterious no longer. They were migrants from southern Europe who arrived during one of history's great crises and became part of the region's complex cultural mosaic.